The Trump administration promised to protect the Second Amendment and to undo the Biden administration's destructive anti-gun policies. And the DOJ promised to disfavor prosecutions of victimless paperwork crimes. But, as we're going to get into throughout this video, that's not what we're seeing. In this episode, we'll ask why elements within the DOJ are continuing to prosecute Timothy Durkin, a GOA member targeted by the Biden administration for his work to keep gun dealers open during COVID. Today, we're going to take a closer look at his prosecution, and we're going to ask why the justice system seems so hell-bent on finishing the anti-gun work that Biden started and sending a non-violent entrepreneur to prison. I'm Phil, and you're watching Law and Ammo. During the COVID-19 pandemic, firearms and ammunition were in high demand. We all remember the prices, the panic buying, and the supply chain shortages. And while gun owners definitely struggled during this time, small businesses did too, especially local gun stores. Think about your typical mom-and-pop gun store. Most will tell you the same thing. Retailing firearms is a low-margin business, and the only way to make any real money is to make up for low margins with high volume. But what happens when all the volume dries up? How do these companies stay afloat when there's no inventory to be found? Not to mention when the sitting president, then President Biden, declares war on gun dealers and announces a zero-tolerance license revocation policy for inadvertent paperwork errors. You get a recipe for disaster and a mass closure of gun stores across the country. And that's exactly what happened during the COVID years under Biden. That's where Timothy Durkin comes in. Tim is a Kansas-based GOA member who many of you may recognize from his popular online firearm parts store, Durkin Tactical. Tim is an entrepreneur, an active member of the Second Amendment community, and a huge firearms collector. One thing Tim noticed during COVID was how badly local gun stores in Kansas were struggling. All their inventory had dried up, wholesalers had no supply, and manufacturers simply couldn't meet the unprecedented demand from millions of first-time and existing gun owners stockpiling anything they could possibly buy. When 40 Smith & Wesson dries up, you know things are bad. And so these mom-and-pop shops were starting to go under. But Tim had an idea. Although his business, Durkin Tactical, did not sell firearms, and therefore he didn't have to have a federal firearms license, Tim still had a good relationship with large firearms manufacturers that supplied many of the parts and accessories he sold online. That manufacturer was named Anderson Manufacturing. And while Anderson would not have picked up the phone for some random mom-and-pop gun store in Kansas, it did for Tim. So Tim asked for a personal favor. Through his business, Durkin Tactical, Tim arranged for Anderson to sell some highly sought-after firearm shipments to a number of Kansas gun stores. The firearms went directly from one FFL, Anderson, to other FFLs, the dealers in Kansas. All these FFLs properly documented the shipments, and the Kansas gun stores eventually sold the firearms to customers, also documenting those transfers and ensuring background checks were completed. When all was said and done, Anderson made money moving its inventory to the gun stores. The gun stores made money selling the firearms to Kansas gun owners, which allowed the gun stores to stay afloat during COVID. And Tim made some money for arranging these transactions in the first place. At no point did Tim ever touch the firearms that Anderson shipped to the Kansas dealers. The guns were shipped directly from licensee to licensee. In other words, Tim was nothing more than the guy who introduced the business entities facilitating transactions between them. And so here's a question you should be asking. Does any of this sound illegal to you? Does any of that sound like a felony? And does any of that sound like it justifies sending Tim to prison for years and also permanently prohibiting him from possessing firearms? Tim certainly didn't think so, and neither did any of the FFLs he facilitated the transactions for, including Anderson, one of the largest firearms manufacturers in the nation, which had its own legal compliance department. But the Biden ATF thought differently, and Biden's rogue DOJ was happy to oblige ATF's rogue agenda. According to them, Tim had been engaging in the business of dealing in firearms without a license, in violation of the Gun Control Act. More specifically, the Biden DOJ thought that Tim's brokering of firearm transactions was actually dealing. More on that a little later. So the Biden DOJ charged Tim with being an unlicensed firearm dealer. But if you think that sounds bad, wait until you hear about this. In 2022, before Tim ever got charged, ATF sent Tim a cease and desist letter ordering him to stop his brokering activities. And of course, by the time Tim received this letter, he had already long since stopped arranging transactions on behalf of Kansas gun stores. The COVID hysteria was winding down. Manufacturing was catching up, and the gun stores were able to stay afloat on their own. Tim never ended up applying for an FFL because he simply didn't need to. In other words, Tim fully complied with ATF's 2022 cease and desist letter, and for nearly 2 years, the ATF left him alone. But then in 2024, during the twilight months of the Biden administration, ATF decided that Tim's compliance with the cease and desist wasn't good enough. ATF decided that what it really wanted to do was put Tim in prison. So DOJ suddenly charged Tim as an unlicensed dealer. When people call ATF arbitrary and capricious, that's exactly what they mean. Capricious means having sudden, irrational, and unpredictable impulses or whims. Here, the ATF did a complete 180 with Tim, and it destroyed whatever remaining trust the public had that compliance with a government cease and desist letter actually means something. But then President Trump was elected in a landslide, and everything changed. So fast forward to today. President Trump is now in office. The DOJ is under new management and a new U.S. attorney is on the job in Kansas. And even better, this new administration has pledged to be the most pro-Second Amendment administration in history. And on top of that, the administration has pledged to end the weaponization that plagued the Justice Department during the Biden years.
That was a given, the ultimate weaponization of the government. But we also, yesterday, I fired the general counsel from ATF. You know, these people were targeting gun owners. Not going to happen under this administration.
But in spite of all these assurances, Tim Durkin is still facing prison. And the charges against him haven't been dismissed. And they're alleging that he's still brokering, which falls under the GCA. As it stands, Tim's case is headed for trial, and the government is going to try to convict him for helping his community during COVID. But on top of all of that, the Gun Control Act does not criminalize unlicensed brokering. As is usual, ATF is trying to change what the law says and add words to the statute that Congress did not use. Let me break this down. The Gun Control Act makes it unlawful for any person except a licensed importer, licensed manufacturer, or licensed dealer to engage in the business of importing, manufacturing, or dealing in firearms, or in the course of such business to ship, transport, or receive any firearm in interstate or foreign commerce. The Gun Control Act then provides in relevant part that dealing requires the repetitive purchase and resale of firearms. But Tim didn't ship, transport, or receive firearms. He never touched a firearm. In fact, notably absent from any of these Gun Control Act provisions is any reference to brokering, what ATF claims that Tim did. The words broker or brokering are nowhere to be found in the Gun Control Act. And that's a big deal because Congress has criminalized unlicensed brokering of firearms in another statute, the Arms Export Control Act, which provides that no person may engage in the business of brokering activities without a license in the exportation context. This means that Congress clearly knows when to say the magic word, brokering, whenever it wants to. But the Gun Control Act doesn't say brokering, meaning that Congress clearly never intended to criminalize what Tim did. But not only is ATF wrong on the law, it's violating President Trump's law enforcement priorities. In May of this year, President Trump came out strongly against the administrative state, explaining that the United States is drastically overregulated. This status quo is absurd and unjust. It allows the executive branch to write the law, in addition to executing it. This situation can lend itself to abuse and weaponization by providing government officials tools to target unwitting individuals. If you've been paying attention to this video, that sounds very familiar. President Trump also declared that enforcement of criminal regulatory offenses is disfavored, and he ordered that these sorts of prosecutions should be brought only when individuals cause or risk substantial public harm. And as you might imagine, all of that leaves us scratching our heads. What substantial public harm did Tim ever cause? Let's go back through what happened. The firearm manufacturer and dealers all completed their required paperwork. Every person who eventually purchased the firearms passed a background check. ATF can trace every single one of the firearms involved. The government collected its tax revenue. Struggling gun stores stayed in business. Livelihoods were saved. People in Kansas were able to exercise their rights and obtain firearms. So there we go. Literally, no one was hurt. And in fact, some people were actually helped. And yet Tim is looking at prison. And the really crazy thing here is that the ATF wanted Tim to get a federal firearms license so that he could, and get this, so that he could do absolutely nothing with it. That's right. The ATF says that people who broker firearm transactions should get a license, but keep none of the records that FFLs are normally required to keep. Because ATF knows, deep down, that brokers aren't really dealers who are engaged in business. But if you don't follow what seems to be some kind of made-up law and you don't obtain a license that no statute requires, then apparently you should go to federal prison as a felon. This is the kind of illogic that appeals only to bureaucrats. Of course, this sort of nonsense made good sense under the Biden administration. After all, Biden made it ATF's mission to close down as many gun stores as possible. And in Tim's case, Biden's ATF sought to punish someone who fought to keep gun stores open. But there's no reason for the prosecution against Tim to continue. Tim is not a danger to his community. Tim never hurt anyone. He only helped struggling businesses stay afloat by engaging in lawful commerce. It's obvious that Tim is not the sort of person that should be targeted. And Tim's alleged crime, if you can even call it that, is hardly the sort of crime that should be prosecuted at all. There are plenty of murderers, violent criminals, drug traffickers, and illegal aliens, one would think, that could take priority over handing anti-gun Democrats a legal victory on a silver platter. And we hope that everyone involved will dismiss the charges against him before he possibly gets convicted, which would set a very dangerous precedent for future abuses. We'll be keeping an eye on Tim's case and keeping up the pressure, and we'll let you know of any new developments as soon as they happen. I'm Phil with Law and Ammo. Thanks for watching.